My boss told me I wasn't ready, then handed me something I couldn't resist, and it changed everything. The day had started like any other in the office, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, the quiet clatter of keyboards, and the distant murmur of voices filtering in from the corridor. I was 24, still in the early stages of proving myself, and today I had a presentation to prepare for. My boss, Eleanor, a striking 42-year-old woman with an air of calm authority, had always struck me as unapproachably confident. Her presence filled the room without needing words, an elegant posture, the subtle sway of her hair as she moved, and a quiet composure that made you want to both impress her and fear her judgment. I knocked lightly on her office door, my palms a little sweaty despite the cool air. She looked up from her paperwork, offering a measured smile that seemed to acknowledge both my effort and my nervousness. "Come in," she said, her voice smooth and controlled, yet with a warmth that felt personal rather than formal. The office smelled faintly of coffee, leather-bound folders, and her perfume, something soft, floral, and lingering just enough to catch my attention as I crossed the threshold. As I stood before her desk, she gestured for me to present the materials. I fumbled slightly, adjusting the papers in my hands, aware of the quiet intensity of her gaze. She listened silently, leaning back slightly in her chair, her fingers tapping a pen against a folder. That tap seemed almost deliberate, a rhythmic punctuation that made me hyper-aware of every word I said. Her eyes, a deep hazel, followed me with a precision that was both intimidating and oddly comforting, as though she could see past the surface level of my words straight into my intentions. When I finished, there was a pause. A long, deliberate silence that made my chest tighten. Then she spoke. "You're not ready yet." Her tone was calm, professional, but there was a subtle inflection in her voice, a quiet challenge. My stomach sank, but I also felt something else, curiosity. Something in the way she said it suggested this wasn't the end, but a beginning. I noticed how her hands rested lightly on the desk, fingers relaxed yet commanding, a small, almost imperceptible motion that drew my attention. Before I could respond, she slid a folder toward me across the polished wood. "Take this," she said, her gaze lingering just a second longer than necessary. My fingers brushed the edge of hers as I reached for it, not enough to be noticeable, but enough for me to feel the warmth and steadiness of her hand. That simple contact sent a strange, thrilling pulse through me, a mixture of nerves and fascination. I left her office with a bundle of emotions, frustration, curiosity, and an unshakable intrigue. The folder in my hands was more than work. It was an unspoken invitation, a challenge that promised growth, guidance, and perhaps something more. As I walked back to my desk, I couldn't stop thinking about the subtle weight of her gaze and the warmth of her presence. In that moment, I realized that Eleanor's "not ready" wasn't a rejection, it was a beginning, a delicate, slow-burning spark that neither of us would ignore. The next morning, the office felt different somehow, though nothing had visibly changed. Fluorescent lights hummed with the same steady rhythm, keyboards clicked in their usual cadence, and the faint aroma of brewed coffee lingered in the air. Yet, a subtle anticipation hung over me as I navigated my way past cubicles, glancing occasionally toward Eleanor's office. I could feel her presence in the quiet spaces, the way the office seemed slightly warmer near her door, the faint trace of her perfume that always caught me off guard. It was mid-morning when she summoned me with a simple nod, her tone calm yet unusually inviting. "I have something for you," she said, holding a small, neatly wrapped package in her hands. She extended it toward me with a deliberate care, as if passing a fragile treasure rather than just an object. I hesitated, aware of the unspoken weight behind the gesture. The package was professional in appearance, no hint of frivolity, but her eyes lingered on me with a spark of something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity and a strange flutter of nervous excitement rose in my chest. The package felt unexpectedly heavy in my hands, the paper smooth, almost silky, and faintly warmed where her fingers had brushed it. I could feel the subtle imprint of her touch, the gentle pressure that lingered like a whisper against my palms. I wanted to open it immediately, yet a part of me hesitated, aware of the quiet tension between us. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't just about the contents. It was about her, about the way she was testing, teasing, and engaging me without ever saying a word. I finally retreated to a quiet corner of the office, away from prying eyes, and carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a set of materials meant to challenge me professionally, a mix of reports, strategies, and notes, but with a subtle twist. It wasn't just work, it was an invitation to prove myself, to engage in something that would demand both focus and courage. The way the package was curated, I could tell she had spent time thinking about me, anticipating my reactions, considering my potential. As I examined the contents, a rush of warmth and exhilaration coursed through me. Each paper, each note, felt like a personal message. Her handwriting, precise yet fluid, carried a kind of intimacy I hadn't expected. Even the placement of a small sticky note, with a single encouraging sentence, made my heart quicken. I could almost hear her voice in the words, teasing me gently, daring me to rise to the challenge. Later, as I glanced back toward her office, I noticed the faintest movement behind the glass, a hint that she might be watching, just enough to make my pulse skip. The package, though ostensibly professional, had become a conduit for something far more personal, a slow-burning connection, a subtle flirtation wrapped in mentorship and guidance. I realized then that Eleanor had orchestrated more than a challenge. She had offered me a choice: to engage fully and step closer into her orbit, or remain cautious and miss the spark that already lingered between us. That day, the office felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced before. Every glance, every subtle sound, the scrape of her chair, the click of her pen, seemed loaded with meaning. The "not ready" comment from yesterday now felt like the first chapter of a story I was only beginning to understand, and the package in my hands was the tempting opening to something I could no longer resist exploring. After the package incident, I found myself thinking about Eleanor constantly. The office seemed charged with an unspoken energy whenever I passed her door, the faint scent of her perfume lingering like a subtle reminder of our interactions. I couldn't stop replaying the moment her hand had brushed mine over the folder, just a brief, accidental touch, yet it left a warmth spreading through my chest that I hadn't felt before. Later that day, I returned to her office, ostensibly to discuss the contents of the package. My steps were hesitant, and my heart seemed to beat louder than usual as I knocked lightly and entered. She looked up from her papers, her expression softening into a smile that seemed to understand all my nervousness without me saying a word. "So, how did it go?" she asked, voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Her tone carried both professional interest and an almost imperceptible personal warmth, as if she were inviting me to let my guard down. As I explained my initial thoughts and discoveries, she leaned slightly toward me, her eyes following mine with an intensity that was both comforting and disarming. Occasionally, her hand would brush against my arm, not enough to draw attention, but enough for me to feel the gentle heat and steadiness of her presence. Each subtle contact seemed to speak volumes. Her touch was light, yet deliberate, as though she were teaching me not only about the work but about how to read the nuances between us. The conversation shifted gradually from professional to personal. She asked about my approach to challenges, my motivations, and even my hesitations. In response, I shared more than I intended, feeling an unusual trust in her calm, measured gaze. She listened intently, nodding at the right moments, her body language open yet refined. Every tilt of her head, every soft movement of her hands on the desk, carried a rhythm that seemed to mirror my racing thoughts. At one point, she reached across the desk, adjusting a misplaced paper, and our fingers touched again. The contact was brief, but I felt a shiver of awareness, a spark of connection that went beyond words. The room seemed to shrink around us, the soft lighting highlighting her expressive eyes and the subtle curve of her lips when she smiled. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning felt intimate, a backdrop to the rising tension and curiosity between us. By the end of our discussion, I felt a strange mixture of accomplishment and vulnerability. The professional challenge had been met, but the real discovery was the emotional closeness that had begun to form. I left her office with a heightened awareness of her presence, a fluttering anticipation at every glance, every movement, and the faint echo of her voice. In that moment, I realized this was no longer just mentorship or guidance. Our interactions had begun to weave a delicate, intricate tapestry of curiosity, admiration, and subtle longing. It was a quiet, slow-burning connection, one that made the office feel alive with possibility and left me wondering how far this tentative intimacy might go. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor seemed to orchestrate a series of small, calculated challenges for me. Each task was designed to stretch my abilities and confidence, but what made them truly compelling was the way she presented them, not as demands, but as invitations. The subtle way she framed each assignment made me aware of her presence even when she wasn't physically in the room, and I found myself anticipating her feedback with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Our interactions became a delicate dance. She would offer guidance with the lightest touch on my shoulder, or linger a second longer than necessary when reviewing my work, creating a warmth that pulsed quietly beneath the surface. Once, when I fumbled over a report, she reached across my desk to adjust a stray sheet of paper. Her fingers brushed mine, a fleeting touch, yet it left an impression that lingered far longer than the physical contact. Her movements were graceful, intentional, but seemingly effortless, like a conductor leading an orchestra, each motion designed to evoke a precise emotional response. I began to notice the subtle rhythms of her presence, the soft click of her heels in the hallway, the faint scent of her perfume trailing behind her, the way her eyes would briefly meet mine and hold just long enough for a flicker of understanding, or something deeper, to pass between us. Each encounter carried an unspoken question: how much could we reveal to each other without crossing the line? And how far could this quiet tension be allowed to grow? There were moments when our professional conversations strayed toward personal territory. She would comment on my approach to problem solving, noting with a subtle smile how my attention to detail reminded her of someone she admired. Or she'd ask, almost casually, about my day, my thoughts, my feelings, in a way that suggested genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. These moments made the office feel smaller, warmer, more intimate. I became acutely aware of how much energy I invested in anticipating her gestures, her words, the lightest hint of her attention. One afternoon, as we reviewed a particularly challenging project, she leaned slightly closer to point at a detail on the screen. The proximity was subtle, but it created a tension in the air, a shared awareness of space and presence. I noticed the warmth of her body just beyond my arm, the slight scent of her perfume mixing with the faint hint of coffee. The simple act of leaning over felt electric, a quiet spark that made my heart rate pick up without a single word being spoken. By the end of the week, I realized that Eleanor's subtle game wasn't merely about testing my professional skills. It was about building trust, awareness, and closeness, layer by layer, touch by touch, glance by glance. The professional mentorship had begun to blur into something richer, something deeper, and the anticipation of each interaction had begun to feel almost like a private ritual between us. I was growing, not just in my role, but in my understanding of the intricate, slow-burning connection that was unfolding, delicate and irresistible, right under the surface of our everyday office life. It was late one evening when the office had emptied, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint whir of the air conditioning. The quiet was comforting, almost intimate, and I found myself lingering at my desk longer than usual, finishing a project that Eleanor had challenged me with. I was surprised when a soft knock came at my door, and she appeared in the doorway, holding a mug of steaming tea. "I thought you might like this," she said, her voice calm and gentle, carrying the faintest undertone of care. The warmth of the mug transferred to my hands when I accepted it, but it wasn't the tea alone that stirred something inside me. It was her, the way she stood there, her posture relaxed yet graceful, the subtle curve of a smile tugging at her lips, and the soft light catching the highlights in her hair. We ended up sitting across from each other, the glow from the desk lamp casting a warm halo around her. For the first time, our conversation drifted entirely away from work. She shared a story about her early career struggles, moments of doubt and vulnerability she rarely revealed to anyone. I listened, captivated not just by her words, but by the honesty in her eyes, the way her fingers toyed absent-mindedly with the handle of her mug, and the gentle rhythm of her voice. I found myself opening up in return, telling her about my insecurities, my hopes, and the pressure I felt to prove myself. Her gaze remained steady, her expression soft, and when I spoke, it felt as though she truly understood, not just my words, but the emotions behind them. There was a profound comfort in this mutual vulnerability, a quiet connection forming in the shared silence between stories. At one point, as I reached for a piece of paper, our hands brushed lightly. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a jolt of warmth up my arm and into my chest. I became acutely aware of her presence, the faint perfume lingering in the air, the warmth radiating from her body, and the subtle heartbeat I imagined under her calm exterior. That fleeting touch spoke volumes, more than words could convey, hinting at the unspoken emotions simmering beneath our professional relationship. We sat in silence for a moment afterward, just enjoying the quiet closeness. Her eyes met mine, steady and understanding, and a gentle smile curved her lips. In that instant, I realized that this connection went far beyond mentorship or office dynamics. It was a delicate, slow-burning intimacy, a recognition of each other's humanity, strengths, and vulnerabilities. As I left her office that night, the air outside felt cooler, yet I carried a warmth within me, a sense of shared trust and understanding that had never existed before. Eleanor's quiet confession of her own struggles, combined with my own vulnerability, had shifted the dynamic between us. What had begun as professional admiration was evolving into something deeper, something rich and subtly thrilling, a connection that neither of us could ignore, yet one we navigated with care, patience, and a growing sense of longing. It was a week later, a soft Thursday evening, when Eleanor invited me to walk with her after work. The office had emptied quickly, leaving only the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of cleaning crews packing up for the night. The city outside was bathed in the warm amber glow of the setting sun, the kind of light that softened edges and made ordinary moments feel cinematic. I followed her out of the building, aware of the slight quickening of my pulse as I walked beside her. The walk began casually, discussing the usual office matters, but soon drifted into more personal terrain. Eleanor spoke about her life outside work, her early days in the company, the balance she had struggled to find between ambition and personal fulfillment, and the quiet moments of doubt she rarely shared with anyone. I listened intently, noticing the subtle shifts in her body language, a tilt of her head, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the small, reflective pauses before she spoke. Each gesture carried an intimacy that went far beyond words. I felt an urge to share my own thoughts and vulnerabilities, and so I did. I told her how much her guidance had meant to me, how her subtle encouragement had pushed me to grow, and how her attention had become something I found myself anticipating, quietly cherishing. She listened, her gaze steady, and when I looked at her, I felt as though she truly saw me, not just the work I produced, but the person I was, with all my uncertainties and hopes. At one point, as we walked past the small fountain in the park outside the office building, her hand brushed lightly against mine. It was unassuming, gentle, yet it carried a warmth that made my chest tighten in the most pleasant way. I didn't pull away, and neither did she. The brief touch spoke more than words ever could: recognition, understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between us over weeks of careful attention, subtle gestures, and quiet mentorship. The conversation slowed as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. We stopped on a small bench, and Eleanor turned to face me fully, her expression soft yet confident. "I see your potential," she said, her voice carrying both pride and something more personal, almost vulnerable. "And I admire how far you've come, not just professionally, but as a person." I felt a swell of gratitude and something deeper, a quiet thrill of being understood, acknowledged, and appreciated. I've felt the same about you," I admitted, my voice slightly trembling despite my attempts to sound steady. "You've changed how I see so many things, and She smiled, a subtle, knowing smile that made the tension in the air feel warm rather than uncomfortable. Our hands met again, this time deliberately, fingers brushing and holding just long enough for the moment to sink in without needing words. There was no rush, no expectation, only the mutual recognition of what had been growing between us, a slow-burning, tender connection that was now undeniable. As we continued our walk back toward the office, the city lights flickering on around us, I realized that we had reached a point of understanding. The professional mentorship had evolved into something richer, more intimate, and deeply human. It was the kind of connection that thrived on patience, subtlety, and trust, and one that promised an emotionally satisfying continuation beyond this moment. A week after our quiet evening walk, I arrived at the office carrying the completed project Eleanor had challenged me with. My heart was still racing, not with anxiety this time, but with anticipation. I had poured everything into it, not only to prove my abilities but because I wanted her to see how much her guidance had helped me grow. Eleanor's office door was slightly ajar when I approached. She looked up as I knocked gently, her face lighting with a soft, approving smile. "Come in," she said, and I stepped inside, feeling the familiar warmth of the room, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft glow of her desk lamp, the calm authority she exuded even in casual moments. She gestured toward the folder I had brought, and I placed it carefully on her desk. As she reviewed my work, her eyes occasionally met mine, and each glance carried a quiet approval that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before. The air between us felt charged with something unspoken, a gentle tension that wasn't awkward but profoundly intimate. She set down the folder and leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed but commanding, the faint curve of a smile playing on her lips. "I have to say," she murmured, her tone warm, "this is better than I expected. You've clearly taken the challenge seriously, and more than that, I see growth. Not just in your work, but in how you approach things, how you think." Her words were professional, yet layered with personal recognition. The room felt smaller, quieter, more private in that moment, and I noticed every detail, the gentle movement of her hair, the soft warmth radiating from her, as she leaned slightly forward, the quiet confidence in her eyes. Then she handed me a small note, her fingers brushing mine lightly as I took it. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in a way that made my pulse quicken. On the note was a simple message, personal praise, acknowledgement, and a subtle hint of trust. It wasn't grandiose, yet it carried a depth of meaning that went far beyond professional feedback. I looked up at her, and our eyes met, lingering longer than usual. A quiet smile passed between us, a shared understanding of everything that had transpired over the past weeks. The challenges, the touches, the glances, the small moments of vulnerability and courage. Without thinking, I extended my hand, and she placed hers over mine. The contact was gentle, deliberate, and for just a moment, our fingers intertwined. It was enough to convey the emotions neither of us needed to name aloud: trust, admiration, and the quiet, tender spark of attraction that had grown steadily between us. The slow burn of our connection had finally reached a point of acknowledgement, and it felt natural, warm, and profoundly satisfying. As I left her office that evening, the city lights spilling across the sidewalk, I carried with me a sense of fulfillment. Not only had I completed the challenge she had set for me, but I had also discovered something far more valuable, a meaningful, emotionally rich connection with someone I respected, admired, and quietly longed for. The story between us wasn't over, but the first chapter had closed perfectly, leaving a gentle promise of what might come next.